Deloitte Future Talk. Innovation. Transformation. Leadership. Disruption. Growth. Let's talk about the future.
Hallo und herzlich willkommen zu unserem Deloitte Future Talk Podcast, dem Podcast rund um Zukunftsthemen. Mein Name ist Anemone Paleko und ich freue mich, dass du heute wieder dabei bist. In unserer heutigen Folge geht es um das Thema Transformation. Unser Podcast-Host Nikolai Andersen und Herr Laamanen diskutieren unter anderem in dieser Folge, was Transformation tatsächlich bedeutet, warum langfristiges strategisches Denken mit erfolgreichen Transformationen verknüpft ist, wie Covid-19 die Art und Weise verändert, wie wir über Transformationen denken und warum wir uns über die Geschwindigkeit des Wandels keine Sorgen machen sollten. Unser heutiger Interviewgast ist also Tomi Laamanen, Vorsitzender des Lehrstuhls für Strategisches Management an der Uni St. Gallen. Mit seiner langjährigen Forschungs- und Berufserfahrung ist er ein Experte auf dem Gebiet des heutigen Themas und hat zudem kürzlich mit einigen Deloitte-Kollegen an einer Studie zum Thema Transformation mitgearbeitet. Den Link dazu findest du in unseren Shownotes. Zu deiner Info: unser Interview findet auf Englisch statt. Ich wünsche dir viel Spaß beim Zuhören.
So I'm sitting here today with Tomi Laamanen, who is a professor for strategic management at the University of St. Gallen. And as I'm saying, I'm sitting together with him. We're actually sitting through Skype, as in these Corona times, people don't sit together physically anymore. But it's also a great advantage because we get to speak to each other. Otherwise, we would have had to travel. Now we get to see each other through video. And I'm really looking forward to speaking to you, Tomi. Thank you for having time for us.
Thank you.
Would it be okay if you could introduce yourself to us? We have some young listeners on our podcast who sometimes want to know, how do I become what this person is? And so how have you become a professor?
So that's actually a long story. I don't think we have time for such a long story, but just a few words about my background. So I was born in Finland, and I did my studies there. I did my 2 master's degrees there, one in finance, one in strategy. And then I continued the same track, doing 2 PhDs, similarly, one in strategy, one in finance. And at the end of the day, somehow the strategy ended up being closest to my heart. And I ended up at the university to work as a strategy professor at the Institute of Strategy at Aalto University, nowadays called Aalto University. I was there 15 years, strategy professor, and then I ended up seeking new challenges because I was thinking that I start to know the Finnish companies so well that I need some new stimulus. So I got this offer to join University of St. Gallen. So now I've been 9 years here at the University of St. Gallen at the Institute of Management and Strategy here in a relatively similar job than what I was doing in Finland, working with companies, working with consultancies, working with students, and trying to advance strategic management field in multiple different ways.
So you did a slight transformation of your own life by moving from Finland to Switzerland. And transformation is actually the topic we would like to cover in this podcast more in depth. Now, I am a consultant, Tomi, and I have sometimes this feeling that transformation is actually a buzzword that we keep on using. We have IT transformation, workforce transformation, organization transformation, and probably the biggest one of all right now, digital transformation. Is that all really transformation?
That's a great question. I mean, there's multiple different types of transformations, as you nicely highlight with those examples. I mean, it a little bit eventually depends on what we define as a transformation and what not. And I would say that typically we tend to think of transformations as this type of large programs that are aimed at improving the performance of companies through profound strategic changes in different ways that they operate in terms of value proposition, customer experience, operations, and organization structure. But I would actually take here a little bit more, you could say, humble perspective of transformation, because oftentimes when we focus on just these very visible transformations, we end up missing the small transformations that continuously happen inside organizations. And it's oftentimes these smaller transformations when we don't need to cause a huge chaos in the organization that are actually the better performing. That they kind of, you could say almost like day-to-day work. We transform this area to make it function better. We enhance the digital experience. We develop different types of new businesses, and gradually the firms ends up being transformed. So like you said, it's not that straightforward. What do we say as a transformation? Because it can happen with so small steps and on a more continuous basis. And that way, the fact that we tend to focus on these larger ones, it could even be to some extent misleading for us, because then we think that it always requires this kind of organizational, you could call it organizational shock to realize the transformation. But that's not really the case that it would have to be.
So for the outside spectator, you don't always have to see that a company has is transforming, but actually you just can feel it by the performance.
Exactly. That's such a great example. There was this one puzzle that strategy researchers discovered at the end of 1970s, beginning of 1980s, when they started studying the population ecology. In their first studies, they said that the companies that are able to change when the environment changes are going to be more successful. That was the assumption, that the environment now changes dramatically and we kind of change alongside with the environment. And then they did the follow-up study 7 years later, and what they discovered was that actually the organizations that did not change that much, they ended up actually succeeding better. They ended up surviving better than the ones that were constantly flip-flopping and changing. When the wind went this way or wind went that way, the companies were changing. And actually those were the weaker performing companies that were changing constantly compared to the firms that were having a clear vision, choosing their direction, saying that, okay, this is where the future will be heading. This is where we will be heading. And then those companies, they seemed like they were not changing, but they actually had this kind of more long-term strategic thinking. And they appeared more inert, but they were, in a way, you could say, more clever in their strategies and more consistent.
Yeah, that's interesting. Still going back to the companies where we from the outside see lots of transformation. You are from Finland. Obviously, one company comes immediately to mind. My first mobile phone was from Nokia. And back then, as a student back then, I was completely inspired by the story of Nokia coming from, I think they did rubber boots to creating mobile phones. And then that great company with those great phones got under trouble and transformed once more from looking from the outside, and is now creating network components, which is impressive. Do you know any other company that is as radically transformed?
That's a good question. I mean, there's many companies that have done quite dramatical transformations along their historical timelines. We almost, if you look at almost any company that is 100, 120 years old, you will start seeing that the business has evolved and fundamentally changed over the course of the years. And like you say with Nokia, when the original toilet paper factories and rubber boot, rubber tire factories and cable factories were going together, the kind of conglomerate that was being created, it provided the basis of choosing that what are the most successful areas to go to. But I mean, there's much more recent examples of similar major transformations, and one company that you for sure know probably very well is Siemens, that has very fundamentally transformed its structure in recent years. So it's if you take the 100-year perspective, it's actually not that uncommon that companies transform quite fundamentally their cores, their businesses and their portfolio compositions. But Nokia, of course, as this kind of more recent years example of if you look at the past 30 years of history, it experienced multiple life-threatening transformations. And I guess that's part of what I was saying earlier, that if you do these big transformations, or you have to do them, they often are life-threatening. And you need to really think of very carefully, how do you actually manage that kind of transformation? I mean, better would be that you wouldn't need to do it, that the company would be continuously improving, continuously evolving with smaller steps and more stable, consistent pattern.
Yeah. You just spoke about a 100-year timeline. Let's shift to a 100-day timeline and speak about COVID, for instance, a little bit. I mean, obviously, 100 days ago, it was not foreseeable what would be happening to the world, actually, and now it has happened. Before we speak about business, let's get to you as a person in your role as a professor. How has COVID affected the way you teach?
Good question as well. I mean, universities, of course, are among the organizations that have particularly been affected by COVID and the kind of protection measures that different countries have taken. I think that the responses of different universities have been quite different, but at least in our case at the University of St. Gallen, it was a relatively quick decision that was being made that, we have been talking about digitalization of teaching for 10 years, as long as I've been at the University of St. Gallen. I remember it was already in my strategies for my previous university at around the turn of the millennium in the internet bubble that we need to digitalize teaching. And as we all know, this breakthrough hasn't happened. We still have professors teaching huge lecture halls of people, thousands of people in a lecture hall in the same way as it was being done probably 100 years ago as well. But it's interesting, when the COVID came, we got Thursday evening an email that, by the way, next Monday morning, all teaching has to be digital. Hundreds of courses, hundreds of teachers immediately had to be prepared within the scope of few days to convert into digital mode of operating. And that was surprisingly smooth, how that eventually happened. We had, of course, great IT support. Without that, it would have been chaos if everybody would have started doing everything by themselves. But having the correct platforms, we had the Zoom platform immediately available, and we had instructions how to use it. And it was almost a surprise for everybody how smoothly the whole university's education was instantaneously moved online.
Do you think it would have worked as well if you would have had a 1 year notice? So 1 year from now, we would like to be digitally teaching. Do you think it would have been as smoothly as opposed to let's do it tomorrow?
I think it would have been probably similar. There would have been probably lots of all kind of work groups and committees thinking about it. But at the end of the day, the real work, how it happened, would have been probably rather similar. Maybe now that we did move directly to this kind of synchronous online education, maybe that could have been more complemented with some kind of videos, self-study materials, even more if we would have had more time to develop those. But in principle, the baseline core offering was surprisingly transferable, and I don't think it would have turned more transferable if we would have had 1 year time to think about it. Probably it could have been even, like you allude to, could have been even more difficult to get it this way, because then everybody would be so flooded with worries and bureaucracy that happens. And sometimes it is so that when you do a transformation, you just need to take the plunge and transform.
That's where my question was actually getting to, because we could also see lots of companies going to remote working quite easily, and of course with great support of their IT departments. But then within days, the entire workforce working from outside of the offices, where you would imagine, at least in Germany, lots of discussions around this. Can we do this? Should we do this? And so on. And so it went quickly, which brings me to the question, do you think this entire COVID situation has had an influence on how companies think around transformation?
Yes, in some ways. I mean, the COVID is so special case that it's almost like this kind of black swan event that comes out of nowhere. I mean, to be honest, it didn't come totally out of nowhere. It was in China already for quite a few months, and we were able to follow it. But people were not maybe making the connection that it could eventually come to you as well, that it would spread so effectively to Europe and US in other parts of the world. So I guess that way it was a surprise how fast it came. But I mean, the signs were there if one would have been able to interpret them correctly. I was scheduled to teach in Singapore in March, so I was following it early on already since the beginning of January when these first few cases started coming in. I was actually quite worried about it already at that point in time. So one of the few cases where I was before the time, because usually as researchers we always study something that things have happened already. But I mean, if you take the 2008 crisis, that was also there. The Fannie Mae and the real estate mortgage funds, they were already starting to go bankrupt at the beginning of 2008. And it was only then the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy that really collapsed it. And that made people realize that now it's on us. But somehow it was already coming. I guess it teaches us as companies and also as researchers, obviously, that maybe we would need to still become a little bit better at sensing these weak signals when they are visible and then making sense of them a little bit earlier rather than saying that it probably nothing will probably change anyway. So we don't have to worry about them. But I think that there is a second aspect of this corona. And like you asked, that whether it makes companies to think more seriously about transformation and about their capabilities to do it. I think so. It does kind of emphasize that we need to be more mindful of the signals, but we need to be also more mindful of thinking of different scenarios where the world can go. And in some ways, the corona, of course, has been also, as you know, that when the tide goes away, we see who was swimming naked. So in a way, it reveals that which companies didn't have the competitive advantage that they were assumed to have, because we've had such great 10 years in the economy worldwide that stock prices are skyrocketing sky high. That I mean, it's hard to say which companies really have sustainable business models, and in a way, it kind of revealed that to us now in here. And of course, then we need to think about that how much is there actually for us need to transform and enhance our business models, enhance our operations to be sustainable in the new normal created by the COVID.
I would like to stay with this topic of speed of change once more. During the time of digitalization, when we started talking about it more and more, there was this idea that due to Moore's law, so the speed of change of technology, speed of change overall is speeding up. So everything is getting speedier. Do you think that is right, or do we just feel everything is speeding up, but actually we are kind of on a constant change?
That's my favorite question. I mean, if you wouldn't have asked it, I would have asked it from myself here in the interview. I would say that, yes, there's many signs that the speed of change in itself is increasing. If you look at the CEO tenures, for example, it is a fact that they have gotten shorter. And of course, also globalization, digitalization, the speed with which information, even viruses, travel, it's faster now in the increasingly interconnected world. Now, having said that, I was reminded by the old article by Igor Antsov in Harvard Business Review 1957, where he starts the article that this world is so terribly fast moving. He cites a fairy tale book about the Red Queen, where Alice in Wonderland is running with the chess piece Red Queen and saying that why do you run all the time everywhere? And why do we still say at the same place? And the Red Queen answers to Alice that this is such a fast world. We need to run in order to even stay in the same place. If you want to go somewhere, you need to actually run twice as fast. And I think this is part of it. I mean, this was what Igor Antsov was starting his article 1957 in Harvard Business Review, and then citing how all the Fortune 50 list, those times people looking at Fortune 50 list, over 60% of the Fortune 50 list companies have disappeared in the past 20 years and changed to new companies. And I was saying how horribly fast this change is. And we could make the same argument today. But then there have been studies that have been looking at the performance endurance, the performance sustainability of companies. And the ironic thing is that actually the company's performance life cycles seem to be almost as long as what they were previously. And so the speed of change is increasing, but the companies are also getting better in matching the speed. So the kind of differential between the external speed and company speed is still kind of relatively similar. It's faster world, but it's also faster companies. So as a consequence, yes, it's a moving train where we are being, but when we are inside the moving train, we don't even notice the speed that much. So yes, the speed of change is increasing, but does it matter for companies that are able to be at the same speed? Not necessarily, because they all have adjusted to the speed already.
And so they shouldn't panic because of that speed.
They shouldn't panic, and we always think that the speed is very high, and that's why I guess we are able to pace our processes and operations to match the speed of the moving train. But we are all in the train, so relative to each other, we stay actually relatively stable.
Yeah, makes sense, yeah. Now, obviously, the topic transformation excites you, Tomi, and you've done some intensive research on transformation as well. Could you let us a bit know what has puzzled you when you did research on transformation, when you looked at the data? What are your biggest learnings?
Good, but what has puzzled? It's always tricky, because we often focus on what did we find rather than what is actually the most puzzling thing. I think one of the puzzling thing for me personally is that if you look at these companies, large companies with top-notch top management teams, super CEOs, excellent processes, structures, all the support of any intelligence that you can buy, and these companies are still able to fail. And it's almost mind-boggling. How is it that you have all these resources, all this intelligence in your use, and the companies still end up in this kind of disruption, bankruptcy, problem situations that we see them ended up? Because you could say that cannot be so hard. I guess one of the reasons for this is that the company tends to be always as good as its present top management team is, as good as its present CEO is, and how it's been managed. So it could be that the company has history of excellence and intelligence, but then maybe it for weird reasons, governance problems, ends up getting wrong person in the wrong place, and things start going wrong. It could be also that some of the developments are so incremental that things start losing the drift, they don't see that what's happening in the outside environment, and they end up with the cooking frog effect, that they end up cooking in the kettle, even though they would have been able to jump out of it at any point if they would have realized that the heat is increasing. So that's maybe one of the most puzzling ones. In terms of some of the more concrete findings that we did in the recent study that we did on the DACH area, corporate transformations, one of the surprises that I had personally, because many companies have created this kind of labeled corporate programs, which have a label and which have a certain specific dedicated timeline, 3-year timeline, and then the transformation program is going to achieve certain specific goals. When we compared these labeled programs for non-labeled programs that were not made with such branded efforts, there wasn't really a performance difference between those two. And it could be that the labeled programs are used in more difficult situations, and we don't see the benefit that we get those. But that was a bit of a surprise for us, because we were expecting that if you end up really productizing the corporate transformation program, branding it, labeling it, creating a specific program management office, that in itself would create it. We did find that the program management offices contributed to performance, but not this kind of particular labeling of the program. That's something that we found. And maybe the third, the tiny observation that also puzzled us based on our survey findings was that many of our interviewees, when we did personal interviews, were emphasizing that this kind of transformation culture is really important in companies. And that was quite uniform between different executives that we interviewed in personal interviews. But again, when we looked at the quantitative survey findings, we didn't really find the correlation between culture and transformation performance. So it's a good puzzle. I don't have a have an answer to this. I think it requires further study to analyze that. What does it actually mean? It could be that the companies that have great transformation culture, they never have to do that types of major transformations that we were studying. So it could be that then the cultural effect is not really kind of visible that much there.
It's interesting that you're talking about culture because so I do a lot of innovation consulting, and we always say you need an innovation culture in a company to be a successful innovator. Is that sort of the same culture, innovation and transformation culture?
Yeah, I would say that probably if you have this kind of innovation culture, then you're in this mode of smaller transformations which happen constantly, have smaller innovations that end up coming. And then maybe for that types of organizations, which are like growth beds of innovations, these kind of transformations are not that much needed. I mean, the Hewlett-Packard is a great example of this. If you think of the history of Hewlett-Packard, it was the first garage company of Silicon Valley, and it had so many amazing tech innovations coming out of the company. But over the years, when it grew in size, it had a big merger with Compaq, it started developing this more top-heavy, more bureaucratic, more cost exploitation focused culture. And it little bit ended up losing this small garages, small innovations happening constantly. And when HP had to do big transformations, it was all the time hurting it. They tried it different ways. They tried doing big acquisitions. They tried to do big cost cutting. And the now most recent one was of course splitting HP again into two different companies, which now seems to be reigniting again the innovation culture to some extent. But I think if one ends up losing the innovation culture, then one needs to do this kind of bigger corporate level transformations to compensate for that. And those are always tricky because you don't get this automatic growth inside the firm. So that's why that could explain the finding why when we looked at these bigger transformations, this kind of culture didn't anymore matter because we were already kind of beyond that. We were fixing problems that the culture had not been able to preempt before that.
That's interesting. Maybe staying quickly with the culture topic, maybe the culture of being self-critical. What I mean is, how can a company actually identify that it needs to transform, or can a company identify themselves? You made this example of the frog in the water that is slowly heating up earlier in our interview. So does a company have the ability to see signs where it says, okay, we got to do something now?
Yeah, I think it's at the heart of the previous answers in some ways that I've given you, because in a way, if you identify that, hey, now we are in huge financial trouble, or now the environment has totally disrupted, then we are a little bit too late already identifying the transformation. So in principle, doing this kind of proactive, continuous transformation, we shouldn't have any trigger. It should be a continuous activity in the organization, even if it would be bigger portfolio reshuffling. Again, with the Siemens example, that reshuffling these different businesses, listing Healthiness as a separate company, but still preserving ownership, and so on. So in a way, this type of continuous transformative activity, both within the company, in the innovation activities, but also in the management of the overall corporate portfolio. And if you do it proactively before any trouble arrives, usually, I mean, if you want to sell something, you also get a better price when you sell a well-performing business than when you sell a business that you want to really get rid of and nobody wants to buy from you. So that way, I would say that the identification of transformation is a trick question, because if you identify it, you're already too late. So you kind of need to do it all the time.
What are the biggest challenges for a company going through a transformation journey?
Maybe I have three that I noticed with my own work with different companies and then with my own research. And I would say that the first one links to what we just discussed again, that we tend to misread the environment and then end up transforming a bit too late. So we're not really matching the environment. And then we become, like I mentioned at the beginning, the researchers who found that the companies that changed constantly we end up becoming this kind of company that doesn't really have a direction, that changes always when the environment changes, but changes too fast, doesn't have a vision that we want to go. So in a way, it's about misreading the environment, not being able to define the vision that makes us successful in the future, and then being forced to transform constantly, being forced to flip constantly. The other question is that, or the other challenge, and it's a little bit related to that, is that sometimes then when we end up transforming too late, we feel that we need to do bet the company type of strategies. When Nokia ended up choosing the Microsoft operating system and abandoning its own operating system, and not even doing Android as a parallel operating system, it was really a bet the company move. And it was driven by the fact that the Nokia was realizing that Apple was now so far ahead, Android was now so far ahead, that they needed something to do something desperate. Their own R&D development wasn't able to anymore match it. And they felt that we need a strong partner that would help us and rescue us. And then Microsoft appeared to be that strong partner. But I mean, that is a bet the company move, because it's betting that Microsoft will help us. A more prudent move would have been maybe to still continue one own software development, to do Android at the same time in parallel, and then maybe also do Microsoft, and then see which path of the three works well. And I see that so often that the companies are saying, though we are so desperate that we don't have any other chance than now do this. And that would be a better company move. And then the third point that I would say would then go into this kind of consistency, that if we see that digitalization is influencing our business, it could be that it doesn't happen next year. It could be that it doesn't happen in 5 years. But if we start doing it 5 years, we are already too late. So we need to be consistent. We need to develop this activity consistently and have our trust. At the moment, there has been this artificial intelligence boom. Many companies have developed all kinds of AI types of gadgets and applications. But as we know from the hype curve, the hype starts already a little bit going downwards, and companies are not that excited about it anymore. But the companies that continue to consistently invest, they will then eventually, longer than 5 years, 10 years, continue to outperform the others. So to summarize, I would say that acting too late is not good. Being kind of having the continuous activity is needed. Betting the company is not good. It's just a sign of acting too late. And then thirdly, when we start doing something, we need to be consistent. We need to put all the small activities, all the small transformation efforts into a continuous path and make it work. I mean, it's the same if you look at the acquisitions, that if you're too late in buying something, you pay too much, the boom is over, all the AI companies are too expensive. If you bet the company, you do a huge mega merger, it's 50-50. You might have a good mega merger, but it might also fail terribly. And then the third thing, doing it consistently. So if we were to go out and say, okay, I'm going to buy during next year 10 AI companies, 10 small technology companies will help me develop this, instead of going for big mergers or going too late, that would be the way to go. It's same for transformations as you would say for example, mergers and acquisitions.
That's really interesting. Unfortunately, our time is almost over. So let me close with one question relating to the beginning of our conversation. As you now look at universities, your own profession, we talked a bit about digital teaching, but what are other topics where you would say universities need to transform? Well,
universities are, of course, all very different in nature. So different universities also have different transformation needs depending on what they are strong at and what they are weak at. I have had this kind of fortune of being in universities that are working very closely with companies. Aalto University, we had very close relationship with Finland's largest companies, and lots of family-owned companies, lots of startups. So that collaboration and closeness was great. And at the University of St. Gallen, the model is very similar, that we work very closely with companies. It enables us to keep the teaching fresh, because if we don't notice to develop some knowledge area ourselves in our research, then the companies will soon tell us that, hey, what do you think about this? And then we realize that, hey, we have knowledge gaps there. So in a way, this kind of customer orientation, when you think of university company collaboration, we have been very fortunate of having that. I know that many universities are not as fortunate, that they are a little bit more distant from the business lab. Actually, if you look at the US universities that are otherwise often very progressive, it's actually relatively few universities that are really focusing and working closely with the top companies. And many of the universities are actually more distant from the companies. I wouldn't like to say ivory towers, but sometimes you could even argue that the research ends up becoming too distant from companies, and then you end up losing. And in particular, in the field of strategic management that we focus on, it's very important that we are close to companies so that we understand the current problems, we understand the mistakes and challenges, and are able to then focus on our research in kind of spending time and reflecting on how we could help companies, how we could advance the knowledge of strategic management in those areas.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring interview, Tomi. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
So, das war's. Vielen Dank, dass ihr wieder dabei wart. Ich hoffe, ihr fandet diese Folge des Deloitte Future Talk genauso spannend wie ich. Wenn euch die Folge gefallen hat, leitet sie doch einfach weiter an eure Freunde oder Geschäftskollegen. Was uns auch ganz wichtig ist, abonniert diesen Podcast, dann verpasst ihr keine Folgen. Das könnt ihr auf iTunes, Spotify, Soundcloud und bei anderen Podcast-Apps machen. Wenn ihr Details dazu sucht, einfach in den Shownotes gucken. Das sind die schriftlichen Informationen, die bei jeder Episode beistehen. Und wenn euch der Podcast gefallen hat, wäre auch klasse, wenn ihr euch eine Minute Zeit nehmt und ihn auf iTunes bewertet. Das persönliche Feedback von euch und auch eure Anregungen sind uns sehr wichtig, denn so wissen wir, wie wir die Podcasts noch besser gestalten können, auf welche Themen wir setzen sollen und so weiter. Einfach auf unsere Website gehen oder auf mein LinkedIn-Profil. Die Details dazu findet ihr ebenfalls in den Shownotes. Da gibt es noch interessante zusätzliche Informationen zu dem heutigen Thema. Ansonsten wünsche ich euch jetzt noch einen schönen Tag, eine erfolgreiche Woche und bis zum nächsten Mal. Ciao.